Welcome everyone to this Sunday afternoon session of Battle of Ideas. The session's called How Do We Solve the Housing Crisis? It's a partnership event with Living Freedom, which is the school for under 30-year-olds who are interested in all things related to freedom. And the producer, and I just want to give a credit because he's not on the panel and not chairing, is Rush Herrera down there. He's put a lot of hard work into developing the idea for this session. One of our young producers, and there's been quite a number this year that have produced sessions at Battle of Ideas. And if it's something that you'd like to get involved in, then you should speak to us afterwards, and we can work out a way to involve you next year, hopefully. I'm Alistair Donald, by the way. I'm the co-convener of this Festival of Ideas. So the way that we're going to run this session, it's a bit of a shorter session. So we're going to do it as an in-conversation for about half an hour between the panelists, and then we'll come right out to you for your questions and thoughts and develop the conversation that way. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just introduce the panel. On my very far right, we have Rabina Khan, who's a writer and commentator, a former counsellor and special advisor. She's the author of a book called My Hair's Pink Under the Veil, which chronicles her early life and political career and dismantles the stereotypes about Muslim women in Britain. So welcome to you, Rabina. Next to Rabina is Charlie Winstanley. Charlie is the Northwest coordinator for the cost of living campaign Enough is Enough. He's a student of and participant within the social justice and activist movement since the age of 13. Wow. How old are you now? 14. In his professional life, he's a political advisor to the Mayor of Salford, but he is speaking on this panel in a personal capacity. On my immediate right, we've got Simon Cook, who's an urbanist, a former regeneration portfolio holder and leader of the Conservative group at Bradford City Council, former that is, worked in business development for housing and regeneration charities for quite a number of years. On my immediate left, we've got Ike Aje, who's a practicing architect, head of housing, architecture and urban space at the think tank The Policy Exchange. And you should go to the Policy Exchange, actually, and read some of the stuff that Ike is in charge of producing, because it's interesting. He's also a writer and visiting lecturer in a number of architecture schools, and he's the founder of London Architecture Walks. Welcome to you, Ike. And on my far left, we've got Austin Williams, who's the director of the Future Cities project here in London. He's a senior lecturer in architecture at Kingston University, honorary research fellow XJTLU in Suzhou in China. And he's the author, building on that experience of the number of years that he had in China, of a book called China's Urban Revolution, Understanding Chinese Eco-Cities. He also co-authored a very good book a few years ago called The Lure of the City, actually, which is one to get hold of if you can. Still available on Amazon. Me. No partisanship. Okay, so just quickly by way of introduction, I mean, basically the property owning democracy dream has fallen flat. Whether you're buying a house, well, it's impossible to find one because there's lack of availability, lack of price. If you want to private rent a house, then it's very difficult because there's high rents and you get lumbered in overly small accommodation with a huge number of other people. It's very cramped. If you want social housing, well, think again, because just 1% of the mix of the build of housing these days is social housing. There's approaching 1.5 million people in the waiting list. So it's kind of, and I just want to, we know the problems that this causes, and I think we don't necessarily need to discuss what the problems are. I mean, we know it's cramped accommodation. We know that there's a homeless problem developing. We know that a huge amount of people's wages go on mortgages these days. Now, arguably that means that the central problem, and the panelists can disagree with me on this if they want to, but is one of a lack of house building. So disagree with me if you want, but that seems to be the nature of the problem. And when I worked as a civil servant, approaching 20 years ago now, one of the main things that was produced in the department that I worked in, which covered housing, was a report called the Barker Report back in 2004, which identified then, and this is almost 20 years ago, a massive shortfall in building and a problem with high prices. And, has it changed Today, well, arguably not, because numerous reports seem to suggest otherwise. Liam Halligan, the economist or economics writer, who I did a conversation with here yesterday, he puts it this way. He says, look back to the 1960s, we built 3.1 million houses in that decade. Look at the 2000s, we only built 1.5 million. Look at the 2010s, we only built 1.3 million. So we're kind of almost down to a third of the level of house building that we were in the 1960s. And for Halligan, that means that we need to build 250,000 a year. For other people, it means 400 or even 500,000 houses a year. So a huge, huge, huge advance seems to be needed over what we can build. Now, just finally, just to, and the panelists can reflect on this, and they can disagree or agree, but there's a number of problems that people have identified and think need to be addressed. And I'd be interested in your thoughts and comments on whether these are actually the problems. The first is the land situation. The greenbelt, people feel is far too protected, should be built on. There's a concentration of land in the hands of too few people, which has an effect of making land components of any house building very, very high. There's house builders. Second problem that people commonly identify, they land bank the land and keep hold of it, build out slowly to keep costs up. They build very poor quality housing. There's a lack of innovation. There's some issues there. Financiers, they don't want to crash the market, so they protect it and won't build out quickly enough, hence the high prices. The planners, overly bureaucratic, overly regulatory, risk averse in every single way. And finally, the final bunch of people that seem to get blamed are existing homeowners themselves, who are protective of the places that they live in. They don't want new people, they don't want new building, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of, I think, some of the common explanations for why there is a housing crisis. So just to kick us off, I think it would just be, let's just work our way along the panel. Start with you, Rubina. And kind of what's your take on just initially on the nature of this problem?
We keep talking about housing crisis, but actually the housing crisis has been here for decades. A decade ago, when the Conservative administrative government came in, we had a housing crisis. I still remember Philip Hammond referring to the Barker report about how that they would be able to build a massive housing programme in order to ensure that we had enough housing for everybody in this country. And we're still having a discussion here now. When I look at the housing crisis, I reflect on when I first came to this country. So I came to this country in 1975. My father came here when he was 19. And the first property my father bought cost £3,000. And he bought it in Rochester in Kent. And he bought it because he had his family who were going to come over and join him. And we would live in this very nice house with him, which just cost £3,000. And for that time, that was a lot of money for him. And then fast forward decades where I have grown-up children who cannot move out of our family home because they cannot afford to buy a home and they cannot afford to pay rent.
Yeah, but Rubina, sorry for interrupting, but what I was trying to do was to cut out some of the description aspect of this a little bit and get to the nature of the problem.
I'm getting to that point, Alistair, and it's really important to have the context behind this, really important to put the human story behind this instead of the statistics. And the reason why I'm putting this back to you is because we have now come to an era in our life where we see the home not as a home, but as an asset. And our mindset is that our financial security, our financial stability all comes not from the workplace and business. It actually comes from owning a home, which has become an asset. And this move where we see the house as being an asset, we have to move away from that. We have to realise that in order to ensure that we address the housing crisis, isn't just a case of supply, it's a case of reform. The renters' reform, for example, which Shelter have been campaigning for, which actually Theresa May introduced. It's in the House of Lords at the moment. It looks at the way we can treat tenants and give them more and more rights. We're talking about land banking. Well, Network Rail has a huge amount of land. It has assets, it has arches, 2,500 stations with 127,000 acres of land. But nobody wants to build around on that land. Nobody thinks about how we can utilise housing on Network Rail land. When I was cabinet member for housing during the period of 2010 to 2015, I led on building homes on Network Rail land. One was on Pedley Street, one was on Repton Street, and it's the first time in our borough that we built homes on land adjacent to Network Rail. Another aspect to all of this is the fact that when we think about the banking industry, the financial sector, in the way banks lend money to corporations who are probably going to be able to purchase, or certain companies who are able to purchase homes. And so that comes back to transparency, the fact that people from have offshore accounts and are able to create a corporation and then purchase homes. That transparency of who owns homes. Look at London. The number of homes that are owned by people from offshore and abroad. We have to look at all of these things. And lastly, because I have young children, and I see the way they are struggling, we're living in a generation where we have priced out homes and the ability for people to purchase homes. And it is our responsibility, just as people around this table having this conversation, and policy makers and lawmakers, we owe it actually to the generation of young people who are struggling to be, as I said before, to purchase home, to live in the rented accommodation.
Okay, Charlie, what's your take on the nature of the problem? I mean, you're working in busy metropolitan borough.
Absolutely. And in fact, I actually helped I feel like I pretty much wrote the entirety of the Greater Manchester housing strategy. Not quite true, but, psychologically, it was a terrible burden. I completely agree with Ravina's comments. I want to sort of come in with a slightly different angle on it, though, and say I think that one of the things I think we need to remember with this housing crisis is that what we're comparing it to, what we're actually comparing it to, is the best period for housing in human history, which was the post-war period, because a housing crisis was pretty much the norm for every other period of history. In 1905, you had house prices which were the same in terms of average incomes as they are today, roughly around 8 times average incomes. In 1845, house prices were more like 12 times the average person's annual income. And I think it's worthwhile just remembering that for most of human history, what housing has been is slums for most people and palaces for a small few. I think what Rabina just said about homes becoming assets rather than homes, I think is one of the key points here. And what I want to say is that I think a substantial push, you can never do justice to the complexity of this problem in such a short period of time, but I think what the single most important factor in the elements which allowed that period of housing prosperity to exist post-war and which are now absent is the absence of the state in the housing sector building truly affordable homes for people. That is why we've failed to keep pace with the 60s and 70s in terms of the numbers of homes being built. I completely agree that delivery is a portion of this problem, but it's also about the types of homes. In Greater Manchester, there's been no shortage of building homes, but an awful lot of these homes, coming back to the assets question, are investment properties. They're not being lived in, or they're second homes, or they're holiday pads. There's just simply building on the delivery, I think, and not remembering also what types of homes we're building, where and who for, I think is also an element of this problem, because an awful lot of the numbers which we have got on paper now aren't actually serving to deal with the crisis which people in this country are facing.
Okay. Simon, what's your take on it? You live in a rural area outside Bradford, don't you? But you're a bit of a greenbelt fan.
I literally live in the greenbelt, right? And I don't live on the edge of the greenbelt or anything. I literally live in the greenbelt. Entirely legally, by the way, and I live in a development that was built in the greenbelt. And we need thousands more of those. So the housing crisis, when we say it's decades old, the identification of affordability and the risks for affordability are indeed decades old. In 1973, Professor Peter Hall Sir Peter Hall, I think he was as well, who was the kind of granddaddy of English town planning, one of the people who helped create the Town and Country Planning Act and things like that. He wrote a thing called the containment of urban England, in which he basically said, we got it wrong in 1947. In 1947, we created a thing called the greenbelt, and as a result of that, we are building up a massive affordability crisis in housing, especially in London, which is the focus of the main focus of his study, but also in other urban areas like the South Coast, Bristol, Birmingham, Oxford, Cambridge. And Peter Hall's comments back in 1973 proved to be correct. The primary reason for housing unaffordability in England is the greenbelt. That is it. And if we do not change the way in which we treat urban containment, we will not resolve the affordability crisis. And that we need to start at that. That's not to say that we don't need to build affordable housing for people in the inner cities, then council housing, and we don't need a range of tenures, and we don't need all of those other things. But we need to focus on the fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem is we have a planning system that is not fit for purpose. It does not deliver what it was intended to deliver. Honourably and honestly, I'm not here to criticise the people who wrote that Act of Parliament and the regulations around it back in those days. They did it because they thought it would make things better. We're now in a stage where we know it is no longer making things better, and when we try to change it, and we saw the white paper where we without changing the greenbelt, they started to look at zoning and looking at something which was closer to what they have in France. What we saw was a huge reaction from within the Conservative Party and the MPs about as they became the kind of shock troops for the NIMBYs. And then on the left, they started talking about it being a developer's charter and other such tommy rot. I mean, what we ended up with was the thing being pulled, and that everybody promising that, of course, they weren't going to change anything about local involvement in planning, which was basically saying, we're actually not going to do anything to rock the boat about building the kind of numbers of new houses that we actually need, which is, we're talking about a thing, you can argue that I think we are currently about 4 million houses short of the number that we need. That's where we are now. So we've got to build 4 million houses just to get to parity. And then we've got to think about changes in population and movement and so forth. So, let's not escape this. And those who know my Twitter account, I'm going to say it. The solution, the first thing you need to do is scrap the greenbelt, reform planning, and build more houses.
All right. Well, we'll come back to some of that because I think there's a lot in there, and it sounds very easy. Scrap greenbelt, reform planning. People have been trying to do it for 50 years.
I said it was simple.
Ike, what's your take on this then? And come at it either from you're a practicing architect or from your kind of more policy-led position, or however you want.
Okay, couple of issues. I'd agree with much of what's been said already. Can anyone hear me? Yeah. Good. I'd agree with much of what's been said already. The changes in the way housing is viewed as an asset rather than something, rather than a home, is not helpful. But slightly, maybe in contrast to what has been said, I do think ultimately it is a supply and demand issue. Look, there may be, roughly 100 chairs in this room. Now, no matter what you do, no matter what incentives and policies you have, because there's only 100 chairs in this room, you cannot seat 200 people in this room. So at the end of the day, we need to build more housing. Now, I know that's been said, and obviously it's what today's about is getting to the granularity of how we do that. But I do think we can't get away from the fact that that is fundamental. I don't want to bring this down to a numbers game, but if you look at the amount of housing we've built in recent years, I mean, in some years, France, a country with a similar population to ours, has built twice the amount of housing that we have. It's ridiculous. We do need to build more. Now, the question has also been posed, the kind of housing we need to build, and I think that's important too. I mean, there's many angles I can look at it from. Policy Exchange runs something called Building Beautiful. Building Beautiful is basically saying that, and I agree with much of it, I'm an architect, I don't want to slag off most of my industry, but a lot of the housing we build today is crap. And because of that, that means that people I hope there's no other architects today. It's not a popular point of view, apart from my friend here around Austin. But the fact is, that leads, as well as that making the urban landscape look less attractive, etc., making cities less attractive, what it does is it feeds into the NIMBY idea of opposition. It's just yet another reason to not want this local development nearby. So I think architectural standards have to be raised. I'm more than happy to spend days and days criticizing the planning system. I agree it's sclerotic, it's dysfunctional, it needs to be completely reformed. But again, we get back to the problem, I think Cheshire and Amersham has been mentioned. One of the problems with the housing crisis is, politically at least, reasons exist to both sustain it and solve it. And by that I mean, there's an obvious imperative to solve the housing crisis, create homes, create growth, etc. But the political reasons to sustain it were brutally shown at the Cheshire and Amersham by-election, where the government did propose reasonably, I mean, it wasn't that radical, a kind of more introduction of zoning principles into the planning system, and it was literally, it caused terror in the home counties, and it was withdrawn. And so planning reform has again been put on the back burner. So this also is another critical issue too.
Go on,
Sorry,
final thing.
I know, one more thing to say as well, and I strongly believe this as well. It's been mentioned before, affordability is an issue, and that's completely true. I think the quickest and easiest way to get around the affordability problem is not building more affordable homes. We have to build more council housing. I'm not saying council housing is going to solve the problem. I believe in the market. I'm not saying the market should step out of it, but we need to build more council housing, make sure it's good quality. We don't make the mistakes of the past in terms of poorly designed and planned public estates. But once we have a decent stock of that around, that will help the affordability issue and take the heat off the incredible amount of demand you have in other areas of the housing market.
Okay. Austin, what's your kind of take on the problem?
Well, first of all, most housing, I agree, is crap, and I apologise. But I moved out of architecture and became an academic precisely because of that. I wasn't very good. So we've got this kind of general consensus how to solve the housing crisis is build more housing. Maybe that's the end of the session. But I do think that, why aren't we then building more houses? I'm less interested, or maybe I should be, but I think other people are dealing with the policy conversations. I think that there's political errors or low aspirations, if you like, which are really infecting the way that we see the need to build or the right to build or even the ability to build. So the idea of innovation and R&D, we just had Liz Truss, who basically said that one of her first policies is to reduce R&D across the board and research and development in terms of how we build in the future. I think it's fundamental because for 5,000 years, we've put one brick on top of another brick with an old bloke in the rain. And I think maybe we could move on a little bit from that technique. And so R&D, whether it's robotics, whether it's 3D printing, or whatever it might be, has potential. At the moment, it's in its infancy, or rather, it's actually reasonably well developed, but it's expensive, and very few people are putting investment into it. When I was working, I used to work for the Architects Journal as a technical editor, and literally from 2000 to 2005, I used to get almost every week somebody sending me a new prefab house. This was part of the modern methods of construction that the government was investing in, and literally it was the same thing, but everybody was reinventing the same bloody wheel, right? You did think the idea of prefabrication was standardized processes where you could roll it out, rather than every architect in Huddersfield designing a bloody prefab and wanting to try and get their name on the branding. So the idea that we can standardize and marketize and maybe kind of roll this stuff out is kind of interesting. There was a very interesting article in the AJ, I think, last week, 2 weeks ago, which was looking at the horrors of standardization, how everything in the city starts to look the same. You can't win in this conversation. Do you know what I mean, right? I think that standardization's got a lot going for it. The second thing is there's a risk aversion as a general philosophical low horizons within politics and more generally. From my point of view, it stems from an environmental perspective, which is that if you think that housing creates the most carbon emissions, and the one thing we have to do is reduce carbon emissions, then it's a very straightforward equation, and you look very, very badly on anybody that wants to make housing, because ipso facto they're part of the problem. So therefore, you know what I mean? It's kind of a philosophical dilemma for architects, designers, contractors, that they're now held to be part of the solution and part of the problem at the same time, and that creates a certain stasis in their ability to really kind of put forward kind of new ideas. And also that has an impact on skill sets. So, you know, we're not really developing the new skills. We're still having bricklayers left, right, and centre. But also we're not developing infrastructure. You know, again, once you think of, you know, an energy crisis, but also a carbon crisis, a global crisis, and a climate crisis, then suddenly, you know, the idea of infrastructure, laying new mains, laying, you know, carbon-intensive construction, suddenly becomes a problem. And I think, you know, unless we really challenge that notion that what we do as humanity is somehow problematic, which is the governing discourse across more than just architecture and housing, but across science and arts, I think we will have a real problem. So being able to kind of counter that idea that the primary goal of building is a carbon reduction one, primary goal of construction is to kind of reduce our environmental harms, unless we can turn that around and really kind of put forward the idea of a human-centric ambition for developing society, then I think we're going to have this conversation for many years to come.
Okay, I'm going to come out soon, but I just want to get a quick response from the panelists to some of the things that have been raised. And Rubina and Charlie, I mean, Simon said we just need 4 million homes, just build them. Kind of why not just get on and build them? I mean, that's in terms of the treating homes as assets, Rubina, rather than homes. I mean, if you built 4 million homes, then you'd get rid of that problem, surely. So why don't we just bite the bullet and get on and build them? Because we talk about these things endlessly, but no one seems to ever break through. So is it this kind of the risk aversion that Austin's talked about, the lack of innovation? Kind of, why don't we do it? You know, where's the blockage?
I think to just simply say, let's build lots and lots of homes, and that's the end of the housing crisis, that's wrong, because within the housing crisis, you have leaseholders who are facing building crisis defects and all the bills that go with it. You also have the problem with right to buy. So, as you know, the right to buy came in. I actually am a fan of right to buy. I think it's a really good thing that happened, and the reason I believe that, it helped people go on to the home ownership. Where it failed was the reinvestment. So to say, we need to increase the supply, which is absolutely correct. But in the meantime, we've got stock in this country that we are not looking to monopolise and maximise. And the other aspect to it is the housing associations. The housing associations in this country, they provide the council, the social housing. So councils provide council homes, and social housing providers, like an array of large housing associations, provide social housing. And the issue I have here is that we are not holding to account the housing associations who are actually going out there building social housing, and also leaseholders and shared ownership. And the point about there are some really terrible homes that have been built. It's the housing associations as well who are building terrible homes for tenants and for leaseholders. Why are we not holding them to account? I saw the social housing bill that's going to go through. It's about time that we got on top of the social housing associations and those rogue landlords. So that for me, it's not just a case of let's build more homes. What we have to hold the people who are the landlords, who are the housing association regulators, the housing associations who say that they are charity-led. We need to hold them to account too.
Charlie, come back on anything you've heard, but again, why not just get on and build them? You said you designed the Salford strategy. So
the Greater Manchester strategy.
The initiative to build a few million homes.
Well, I mean, lots of reasons. If I can just come back on some of the things that have just come on the panel, I just wanted to make the point that there's lots and lots of things which got a lot of validity that have been said, but I just wanted to point out that the period of time that I was discussing before, when we got as far as we've ever got as humanity of solving the housing crisis in Western countries, was a period where the Town and Country Planning Act was in place, the greenbelt was in place, a lot of the obstacles which have been raised on this panel were in place. And so to say that the greenbelt is the primary obstacle to delivering these houses, I just think doesn't sit right. There are some elements of greenbelt which I know from having had to deal with local plans, which can be incredibly problematic in terms of providing things. And there's a lot, I'm not a greenbelt absolutist either. But I think that if we're being realistic about what will actually solve the problem, getting rid of the greenbelt isn't part of that. Isn't completely part of that.
Let me put that then to Simon.
I think, whenever I have this debate about trying to say how do we resolve the housing crisis, and I always start with that pretty blunt position which says the primary problem is the planning system. The decade when the UK delivered the largest number of houses without any need for the government to stump up any money was the 1930s. And in the 1930s, we built about between 300 and 350,000 houses a year. And and you know and love those houses. They are other people, architects may disagree with me, but I consider the 1930s semi to be the finest English housing form.
Yeah.
And we delivered those without a planning system and without needing huge amounts of government money to be thrown at it. So my view is that if you want to harness the genius of people who build houses and architects and all the other, and individuals who own land who might want to build their own house, then the best way to do it is to actually make it a lot easier for people to build houses.
You very skillfully avoided answering the charge from Charlie.
What was the charge?
The charge was that the greenbelt has been in existence since 1947, and the largest he's arguing.
Yes, we peaked in our house building in the 1960s.
Okay,
and
so
a much more sustained period of house building from the 45 through to the late 70s than existed in the 30s.
Yeah, so,
all right.
Okay, I always try to avoid getting into the nitty gritty of the debate around 50s and 60s house building. The 1960s, we demolished 1.7 million houses across the north of England. We demolished them, and we replaced them with about 1.5 million council houses. We did not increase the housing stock as a result of that thing. It is one of those pernicious myths about that particular.
During that period.
Okay, so that was the answer we were trying to tease out of you. Ike, pick up on anything that you want. But I guess the question that I've got to you is, are you not just exhibiting the sort of risk aversion that Austin's talked about in your kind of, we need to tiptoe around and kind of build nicer places, and that discussion goes on endlessly, and ultimately it becomes actually the justification for not building anything at all. So kind of are you exhibiting those same sort of risk averse tendencies that's part of the problem?
Possibly, to a degree. I think the kind of risks Austin's relating to are more to do with standardization, manufacture, the fact that architects are obsessed with reinventing the wheel every time, when at the end of the day, I'm not diminishing the wonder of any housing, including your 1930s semi, but it's 4 walls and a roof. That's fundamentally what it's all about. So there's no need to spend acres and acres of time being risk averse because we're not sure if that's kind of innovative enough.
Yeah, but just to explain it a bit more, because if you apply to build these houses, then what you'll get is an endless process of micromanaging these through. It's a kind of bureaucratic inertia because the starting point is that the permission is actually something to deny rather than really something to offer.
It is, and I would say it goes back to the point about the planning system needing fundamental reform, because the planning system does, in many ways, place barriers to the kind of solutions we all would like to see. Now, on one level, the planning system does an incredibly useful and important job. I know we can talk about whether planning is now better after the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act than before, but in essence, a planning system is there to protect development, to ensure that we have quality, to ensure that you have enough space between houses, to ensure that people have access to green space. It all sounds wonderful. But it
sounds like it's to protect against development is the point that I'm making.
That's what does tend to happen now. But the thing is, I think we need a planning system that finds a way to still promote development and promote quality. And the problem is now we have the worst of both worlds, because we have this cumbersome planning system that is dysfunctional and doesn't work. But if we had the current planning system and it produced wonderful housing and it produced wonderful spaces and it made it a joy to live anywhere in the UK, then I'd still be a bit aggrieved that the planning system didn't work. But at least we could see a product and a kind of result from it. But that doesn't happen at the moment.
Back on any of this as well?
Very quickly.
Right, so I just wanted to say as well, when you actually crunch the numbers, I don't buy that the planning system... is this on?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I don't buy that the planning system is, again, one of the primary obstacles here. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of unused planning permissions which have been granted by councils up and down this country, which developers are sitting on and not utilising. Councils are providing planning permission hands over fist. We need to. We're now given objectively assessed housing need numbers from government, and if we don't provide the houses which are stipulated in those requirements, which are calculated to provide 300,000 homes a year in the country, so that's how they're provided. If we don't provide those and a 5-year forward supply of those sites for developers, then our plans are considered out of date and they can be challenged by developers in the courts. We lose on appeal, and it's an incredibly costly process. This isn't the planning system either. I'm not saying we shouldn't reform the planning system. I'm not saying there's not stuff to be done. But to say that it's one of the main obstacles, it's not. The problem here is you've got
Hang on, let me cut in because I want to get out to the audience ultimately, actually. But I would just want to be fair, bring Austin back in the end, because actually, Austin, has Charlie not got a point in a way? Because as I understand it, there's somewhere around about 45% of planning permissions that are issued every year that actually nothing gets built on. So there's a kind of the risk-averse mentality, you could argue, is with the builders themselves, or to come back to what Ike was saying about the Chesham-Amersham situation. I mean, is it not the politicians that have given ground, been risk-averse themselves, and actually not standing up and to the reaction against building?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Ike's just given light to the myth of 7 years of architectural training to create 4 walls and a roof, which is slightly undermines my job. But no, I completely agree with Charlie. I mean, there is this kind of, I mean, it's almost Stalinist in its simplicity, which is that there is a numbers game that you have to provide that many houses in order to fulfill the quota to get your money and all the rest of it. But very often they're not built. So people are then sitting on it for other land banking reasons, right? So there's all that going on. And I taught for a long time in China, and it's very easy in China because basically it's completely quota-driven. So, you know, when John Prescott in 1997-98 said that we're going to build 4.4 million new houses in 20 years, China built 4.4 million new houses in 6 months, right? But it's not the fact that anybody knew where they were going to go or who they were for. They just did a general rule that you're going to get 500,000 houses in Chengdu, you're going to get 500,000 in Xi'an. Nobody asked whether it was family houses, single-person houses. You just fulfill quotas, right? So I agree in some respects with Rubino that these things have to be kind of cleverly thought out, and that requires strategic planning. And the one thing which is absent from political conversation today is strategic or planning. And I think that that's the bit which we have to come down to. Otherwise, it just becomes numbers games. I think that when it comes down to the idea of 1960s, the best decade for building houses, right? The best year in the decade was 1968, where we built 425,000 houses. Now, why did there become a terminal decline in house building after 1968? I'll tell you, Ronan Point, right? If anybody's old enough to remember, Ronan Point was a high, a prefab technical innovation which couldn't withstand a gas blast, and 4 people died, not as many people think, but it collapsed and it created a complete psychological trauma on the industry as to what we build, how we build, and the techniques that we build. And we just retrenched and kind of came in on ourselves. And from that point, there's just been a decline. It's starting to pick up now, right? But I do think that Grenfell Tower is the new psychological trauma, right? And that is either environmental or health and safety or fire safety or whatever it might be. These are the things that are a broader social, political conversation. So it's planning in a political sense rather than planning in a policy sense, which I'm interested in.
Okay, good. So, right, out to all of you.
So many housing developments are stopped or delayed for decades as a result of NIMBY intervention or the saving of a tree. And politicians of any party don't want to change anything, e.g. planning, as it costs votes and they may lose their jobs. How do the panellists think this can be solved?
Okay.
I want to raise something I don't think anybody's mentioned yet, and that is banks. A fall in house prices is not the easy solution it appears to be. In fact, at the moment, it would have disastrous effects on the economy. And the reason is banks and building societies. House prices are secured lending. You all know this, that when you take out a mortgage, you secure it against the value of your house. If the value of that house falls, then your loan can become unsecured. Now, as it stands, the Bank of England has firewalled banks to a fall in house prices of around 30%. So we're not talking about bank failure here, but we are talking about banks stopping lending. And we are talking about the fact that banks will not lend into a falling housing market. And I would beg to suggest that private builders won't build into a falling housing market either. So if you are going to engineer a fall in house prices to make them more affordable by vastly increasing the supply, then you will need intervention in the mortgage market.
It was mentioned one of the important things about building more houses is the cost. And you mentioned about perhaps some factory-made houses. Well, by far the biggest component of a house is the land. It varies. I think around where I live, about 75% of the value of a house is the land. So if you can substantially reduce the price of land, then you're going, making a good contribution. Now, one of the proposals I read a while ago is that we're going to build houses in the future, whether it's on green land, agricultural land, etc. Now, all the places they are going to build on, that's on now agricultural land or green land, they're going to go up, what? Is it 10 times? I don't quite know what they're, but 10 times in value. Now, think in long term, if the government borrowed money at relatively low interest rates to compulsory purchase all agricultural green land, they can rent it back to the farmer at the going rate, and then when they do build houses on that land, then they've got the community, if you like, has got the benefit of that asset, either to reduce the price of the land and the housing, or to go into the pot to build more houses. It's a long-term proposal. I thought when I read it a while ago, it sounded a good idea. Well, I haven't heard it. It pops up now and again.
Listening to Simon and his wish to run bulldozers into the greenbelt reminds me why I'm a Green. I want to defend the greenbelt against what you've got in mind, and I think that there's actually plenty of examples of urban sprawl that you can go and see. For example, I was not long ago in Montreal. You can drive out of a centre. It's a modest city. It's not a huge population, but it's very, very low development. And there are plenty of cities like this. You can drive for an hour and a half and still not see any Canadian countryside. You can drive an hour and a half out the centre of London, and you can be in hunting forests, you can be in the North Downs, you can be... Anyway, the compromise that was reached in the 60s, which I think echoes the point made by the last speaker there, it was new towns, where everything was run essentially from the centre, with new towns built, and you built places like Harlow, and you built places like Milton Keynes. And these were the places that people decanted to, the other side of the greenbelt. And there are plenty of opportunities to do this. Greenbelt land doesn't just exist around London, there's other substantial tracts elsewhere. But that would then allow access for those that do remain in the urban centres of the green spaces that they need, the large spaces. I don't see this as a demand and supply problem. Fundamentally, I think this is an allocation problem. We abolished rates at the same time as the poll tax. Rates were fiercely progressive, and they taxed people for living in large properties heavily. And that encouraged people that were then under-occupying those properties to release them for families and release them for new people to come in. That doesn't exist anymore. Council tax is nothing like as fiercely progressive. I think we need to re-reform our local taxation base in domestic properties. And also, there's a very simple answer for most of you privately, if you want to get a house, and that is to relocate to a cheaper part of the country. You can buy a house around my way for 90 grand.
No one wants to live round your way, though. That's the problem. Yes.
Hello. My question has 2 points, and it's mainly for you, Charles. I am a Salford resident and I live in social housing. The two problems are we are either living in houses that are too old, that most of our things in our homes don't regulate with modern day health and safety regulations, or they're brand new built, but because of how badly they're built, things are constantly breaking. And the other fact is that the council house and social housing lists are so long that it's impossible to get social housing. And us people that are in social housing are usually vulnerable people. We are disabled, we are mentally ill, we are single mothers, we are escaping abuse, war-torn countries, etc. You are putting people who are vulnerable in very dangerous places that are unsuitable to live in. And I think it's wrong. Are you trying to change this?
I wholeheartedly agree with the points that Ike was making about building more beautiful buildings. I think the more places like Bath that get built, I think we'd all be better off. So I'm thinking, what are the barriers to architects building in more beautiful styles? And do you think that if we built more beautiful, then people would accept more development?
Okay. Rabina, anything you want to pick up on?
Yes, I do. Just the first question. I feel as though you may have been at my planning committee because you mentioned the tree. I was on the planning committee at Tower Hamlets for about 3 years, and incidentally, I can now talk about this planning application. There was a tree, and it was called the mulberry tree, and there were petitioners there who talked about saving mulberry tree on this development. It was the Queen Elizabeth Hospital development. And when you spoke about whether politicians think about whether or not they were going to lose their seats or votes. But actually, the planning committee is a non-partisan committee. You cannot go into that committee taking your political views. You've got to make sure that it addresses the local council's policies and the planning framework. And yes, people do listen at committees, at the petitions, but what, as a committee member, for us is to make sure we get the most amount out of that planning application, whether it's planning obligations, section 106, the most number of homes, affordable homes, all the things that we need, including infrastructure.
Charlie, yeah.
Can I please have two, Alistair, as I had a direct question?
You're going to have to skillfully weave them into one response.
Okay, very well. Okay, I'll start with yourself. I mean, the stock condition was one of the things I wanted to sort of talk about today. Obviously, it hasn't come up. We have a stock condition problem in this country in general. I'm not trying to say this to avoid your specific problems in your accommodation, but almost 17% of the UK's housing stock is considered non-decent for human habitation by the English Housing Survey. The highest proportion of this is in the private rented sector, where nearly a quarter of all homes are considered non-decent for human habitation. Following that, it's the social rented sector, where 11% are considered non-decent for human habitation. It's quite a high bar. Understandably, the area where there is the lowest number of non-fit homes is in the fully owned sort of privately owned sector. I think it is a really terrible situation. Obviously, in terms of what the situation is now as well, it's made worse for the fact that many councils have sold off their housing. So I imagine if you're in social housing in Salford, it's not a council house anymore because we've got very few of them. For housing, there we go. A familiar name for me in the office. Yeah, so no, there's a lot of. The only thing I'll say in defence of the housing associations is their entire business model has been turned upside down by several governments who are determined to basically squeeze them out of existence and turn them into fully commercial providers. That doesn't justify everything, doesn't justify the extortionate salaries they're paying their executives. It doesn't justify the overly bureaucratic systems they have to prevent people from being able to report problems. It doesn't justify any of that. Okay. Just to say that, yes, absolutely, we spend probably about half our time in the office dealing with complaints from social housing providers, and it's not good enough.
Simon.
7 points, you said.
No,
Is that right?
I don't said one.
It's hard. I want to tell you something about house prices because I think that's really quite important. And about if you're going to have you're going to reform planning and you're going to create a system whereby you increase the rate of house building, you need to do it in such a way that it doesn't result in a house price crash. I mean, because that's not actually in anybody's interest. So if you're looking at a strategy, then the strategy has to start with, say, I'll make a straight country comparison between the UK and France, and I appreciate the mortgage systems are not quite the same, and the French have but French people can borrow to fund their deposit. So there are some things that we don't do. But for me, the critical point here is that the house prices in France have pretty much tracked average earnings. So as average earnings have risen, house prices have risen more or less. Some years it's a bit more, some years it's a bit less. So housing has remained relatively, to buy has remained relatively affordable in France. That is not true in the UK. If you look at the nice little graph of what happened since 2005, the gap between average earnings and house prices has gone crazy. And so the answer for me is to look at that situation in France between 2009 and 2019, which I think is a post-crash, pre-pandemic period. France built 370,000 houses a year, and the UK built 180,000 houses a year. And nobody had a house price crash anywhere and all of this kind of stuff. It seems to me, if France can do it, those perfidious people on the other side of the channel, then we can do it. It's not rocket science. It's not hard. And it doesn't solve all these questions of stock conditions and lots of other issues. There are a whole pile of other housing issues. But the crisis is about supply.
Or we could pay people a bit more wages.
Well, I'm all in favour of that as well, but I think we need some economic growth and that's a different subject, which...
All right, Ike.
Not giving us time to discuss, Alistair.
Well, no, I think, funny enough, they don't want to get into how we get economic growth and a housing growth.
Yes.
Just really quickly, France has been mentioned a bit. I mentioned France as well. One reason France has been able to build more housing than we have done is because they take quite a authoritarian, centralist role to house building. They literally find mayors who weren't building enough, and many mayors would just shrug their shoulders in a Gallic way, take the fine, and not build the housing. So, but basically, it would be very difficult, I think, to impose those kind of rules over here. So I'm not suggesting anyone is saying that, but there are kind of cultural differences between the two countries that make what they delivered easier maybe than over here. In terms of my one point, which I'm going to skillfully weave together, I'll address the NIMBYism point first. Now, I wouldn't want anyone to leave this room thinking that there's any solution or any way we can solve NIMBYism. We can't. It's part of human nature. We're territorial creatures by our nature, and we all have an interest in our surroundings. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I wouldn't necessarily want to live in a society where people's rights to object to what they see as unfit housing is stripped away. But on the other...
Is that right, though? Because if you look at something like Milton Keynes and the way it was built out, then it was a huge amount of building in the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
And it subsequently became a very attractive town, and a town that wanted to build more because people wanted to come there. So are you not kind of giving some sort of naturalistic explanation for the way we want to live that ignores the reality of if you provide decent places and provide the infrastructure, like Austin said, then people are quite content actually to have more people near them.
Well, that was going to be my next point. And my yes,
No, you're not allowed more than one. I only had 7. You can't have any more.
It was point A and B, not 1 and 2, so there were two different, same point. But he's right. Basically, the counter to NIMBYism, I think, is quality. The way in which to make people less likely to complain about new developments is if they have more confidence that the developments near them are not going to be ugly, or they're not going to spoil their surroundings or subtract from what they have every right to consider to be their home. So I think the way to address NIMBYism isn't stripping away people's rights to object during the planning process. It's just making sure that we deliver quality more regularly than we do at the moment. And that
you've got a quality solution.
My quality, well, not really a solution, but an observation at least is there was another question about building beautiful and Bath. Now, Bath is stunning. I'm sure anybody who's been to Bath would agree with that. I wouldn't necessarily say everywhere has to look like Bath, but we also have to I do think there is a problem with architectural quality. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I get all that. But there are certain things, there are certain kind of objective truths about how you build architecture and do things well. And I don't think that happens often enough. And I think if it did, if people did have more confidence that these places weren't going to be ugly or poor quality, then it would certainly help. It would help the planning system work better because it wouldn't be clogged up with objections. So I do think this idea of quality is crucial to how we dig ourselves out of the housing crisis.
Austin.
Yeah, Ike's obviously after a commission from the King.
Bath wasn't the only good example. There are others too.
But I think that the Build Beautiful question, there's a couple of things I can't now address, but we'll come back at the end, I hope. But the Build Beautiful thing, I'd look at it slightly differently, right? I take what you're saying. I'm just interested in what makes construction unacceptable, which is the NIMBY conversation, really. And I think if you can convince people that something is socially beneficial, not just attractive, but socially beneficial, then people are willing to go with it, right? And, just take the example of fracking. God, I've raised that question, right? But the notion of fracking, where the government says we're going to bring back fracking, okay? Then they collapsed, obviously. But generally, they're going to bring back fracking, and then they left it like that, right? And then if you're in a local community and you want it, you can have it. If you're opposed to it, then we won't do it, right? There's no sense of convincing anybody that it's a good idea, or plenty of ideas it's a bad idea. But you have to convince people. Do you know what I mean, right? So the idea that if you're going to build a new town, and I'm with the idea that we need to build more cities. Milton Keynes is the last city town we built. We need to kind of have much more kind of higher aspirations than that. But obviously there will be a sense that, I don't want it near me, right? Or I don't need to build an estate near me, let alone a new city near me. But if you can convince people that it's a good idea, then it works. And I was thinking about this before the session in terms of the National Grid, right? The National Grid, which I think is one of the most brilliant infrastructure projects ever envisaged in Western society. That idea that in the interwar period in this country, 1928 to 1933, the idea that you were going to electrify the system and bring electric light bulbs and stop people having candles in their houses and build a modern society like some of Europe already had, by building pylons all over the countryside. Can you imagine that conversation today, right? It just would not go, you wouldn't have one, let alone the entire nation covered by them. You had John Maynard Keynes, you had Rudyard Kipling, who were actually leading a campaign against pylons, right? Because they were besmirching the countryside. But in general, the political aspiration won the day. But that was a very tough kind of conversation to be had about how you take society forward. And that's the bit which is lacking in this discussion.
Yeah, okay, very good.
Two things. One, around, it's come up a few times, the idea of new cities. So I guess if you're for new cities of 1 million, you've solved the housing crisis. Yeah. And I think that's how that could relate to what China's done. And although obviously it's going very bad at the moment with Evergrande, but it did seem to work, that they funded their local government through granting them that land, and they sold that land to developers, and it did generate growth, obviously, to a large degree. Second thing, to also maybe avoid some of the political opposition, like if you look at programs like Grand Designs, people want to build their own houses. So could you kind of switch the dial and say there is a right for individuals to buy land to build on, and then people have to argue against that and say take away my right to build land instead of always having this fight against the NIMBYs.
Okay, thank you.
There's a fundamental problem with the assertion that planning is not a restriction on, or not a cause of high house prices, which is the implicit assertion that the law of supply and demand doesn't apply to the property market. That's just incoherent. And we can test that empirically by looking at the difference in price between land that does and that land that does not have planning permission for residential accommodation. So as a matter of fact, that's simply false. But the planning system as it currently exists, in other words, one in which a local authority elected mainly by existing house owners in the area, so not by people who want to come in and live there, who don't live there but want to do so, have a discretion as to whether to allow property to be built. So in other words, people are stopped from building on their own land except where the state gives them permission, is fundamentally, irredeemably and inherently corrupt. Because the people who elect the local authorities, the local authorities who have to decide in their discretion whether to give people permission to build on their own land, is elected by people who live in the area and have no incentive to take into account the interest of people who don't live in the area but want to do so.
Hi there. I'm just being put off at the moment looking at medium and high density housing in Manchester because I'm worried that I'm going to get a noise complaint from the floor below me that I'm walking too loudly at night. And that might sound ridiculous, but I've got a friend who's in a bit of a pickle because they're sort of in that situation at the moment. And I was wondering if sort of noise transmission rating so that I could have a look at the housing, have a look at a fact sheet and go, oh, that's good. You know, it would encourage me to look at a lot more houses on the market. And how do people feel about that?
This is not my main point, but France, spend a lot of time in France. House prices have massively shot up in like Rennes, Bordeaux, Paris over a long period of time. And they had the same trend of like people leaving cities, leaving Paris and moving out there. The house prices are mental. They've not really tracked, unless you're buying out in the middle of nowhere, it's not tracked like in terms of, it's not very affordable. My main point is I read recently that 650,000 properties are empty right now. Surely there's some avenue there, either by coercion or encouragement where we can get people to kind of like rent those things out, surely, and that would help with this.
There's a worryingly coercive mood in this audience.
So a point was raised earlier that a number of planning permissions are given and then never executed on. And given the economic incentive of planning permission land being worth quite a bit more than unplanned land, would there be a route through removing planning permissions if they're not executed on within 24 months or 36 months? And so why is that not incentivizing people to build on said land? Should we reduce that to 6 months or 12 months? And I can see that as a developer, that would be dangerous, but that would be part of the cost of doing business in the country.
Hi, yeah, I think it's interesting. We've only really been talking about housing in Britain. We did touch on France, but apparently the picture there is not that rosy either. But my American friends say that none of them can afford a house. I hear the same from Canadian friends, Australians. Like, it's not just the UK where like houses are completely unaffordable and like young people can't buy a house. So I wonder, is that just a coincidence, or is there some kind of global trend here that that Britain is really just one small part of?
I'm not sure that's completely accurate, actually, the comparison. I think there's much more of a problem in the UK than there is in some of the other countries that have been mentioned. But yes.
Yeah, I have a similar impression to his, that it seems to be happening across many countries in Europe and South America, where I'm from, and North America and Asia. My question is on the other side. Do we have any success cases or any examples that we can learn from and take some of those lessons rather than just having this pessimistic view that everywhere is going through this crisis?
Okay, thank you.
People have been talking about the greenbelt and architecture and this, that and the other, which is all fine. But the problem is that people can't afford the properties that are there now. And I think what's been missed from the panel and maybe the speakers and yesterday by Liam Halligan is the reason why that might be. But with, unless we can understand why that is, we can all talk about lovely things, but it's not going to make a difference. It's no real coincidence that the last 30 years, that's what's seen the explosion in house prices. And it was being talked about the right to buy, which was, we all know that's the right to buy council properties, but the impact of the 1988 legislation, prior to that, a landlord wasn't allowed to charge whatever he wanted to charge for his accommodation. You could live in a place, the rent officer would set the rent, so a nice 3-bedroom place, that's 50 quid, you can't charge more. When the Housing Act came in 1988 that removed those regulations, all of a sudden landlords could charge whatever they wanted. The people already in those tenancies, they had to keep the low rents and they weren't allowed to be evicted, but landlords were paying people to move out so that they could triple, quadruple the rents. So we've seen the rents going up and up and up and up, but that's only sustainable because those rents are subsidised through housing benefit and universal credit. Because no one can, well, I'm looking around, there's some quite wealthy looking people here. Most people can't afford a £1,500 a month rent. They just can't. So it's only possible to do that through the state subsidies of housing benefit and universal credit. So it's like the vicious circle that's continued. there was mention about properties being an asset. They weren't an asset before, but they became an asset because landlords would then buy properties, rent them out, charge high rents, buy another property, the rents go up, the rent service say, oh, rents are high in this area, therefore we're going to increase the amount of housing benefit for those properties. So we're stuck in that vicious circle and nothing can continue. So I think Ike is the only person that made the proper point that unless you build council housing with low rents, then we haven't got a chance of solving this housing crisis because there's only low rents that will prevent landlords charging these high rents, which they're entitled to. So the issue isn't about whether the architecture's crap or what it's like living in France. The problem is that rents are too high, and the only way to stop that is by building council stuff.
Although it is worth pointing out that if you look at the situation in Scotland just now, where they just have frozen rent rises, then what's happened is that lots of houses have disappeared from being available to rent. So there's a kind of, it's not as simple.
I'll just briefly come back on that, if that's all right. Honestly, for 10 seconds. I mean, the lady from Salford talked about living in housing association properties. They can grant tenancies to new tenants, and they call them affordable tenancies. So if that rent is within 80% of the private sector, it's affordable. So housing associations are ripping people off as well by charging them £1,000 and calling it affordable.
I think you make a very good point about the way that the state finds various mechanisms to subsidise and keep prices very, very high. And it's not the tenants or the homeowners that benefit from that, that's for sure. Yes, who's got the mic?
A couple of linked questions. One is, to what extent is the climate of environmentalism, the ideology of environmentalism, responsible to the attitudes of house building? People have talked NIMBYism, but I wonder if it's as narrow as that, and whether there's a broader problem of just not wanting to grow and develop, and economic growth being something that's a sort of a bit of a regarded in slightly negative terms in a lot of society. The other thing is more specific. It's about brownfield sites, because I live in London, and it's like high rises are going up like mushrooms in the night. And it doesn't seem like it's going to solve the problem, because a little bit like somebody was saying, I mean, I might be entirely wrong on this, but you kind of do feel, observing it, is that those houses, those apartment blocks, which get higher and higher, aren't really about solving the housing crisis. They're not about giving people homes. They're about what the construction industry thinks they can get away with within the brownfield planning rules, perhaps. I guess it's just that, am I wrong or right on that?
My sister's a Green councillor in the West Country, and we've got into some arguments because she's on the planning committee and is involved minutely in these decisions about where houses get built, what houses get built. And what became obvious to me was that she's kind of making decisions on the basis of lifestyle, and on sort of whether people get the bus to work, whether they've got a car, where they do their shopping. And she's making these decisions, micromanaging other people's lifestyles, and then ultimately denying them the chance or the potential of having a home, which seems, I find that grotesque. The second little thing I wanted to say was on this issue of high prices. You can get away with high prices if you've got short supply. Then you can push them up and up and up. And so it always comes back to the problem of supply. That's the issue we've got to solve.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to take any more. It's just I'm getting told that I've only got 5 minutes left, and I've got a panel that is going to kill me if I don't give them at least a minute to sum up. So, shall we just go along the line, actually? Rubina.
The planning framework does need to be reformed, and at the centre of it, we must put communities and people, because they are the ones who need to benefit. They are the ones who need the housing, who need to be ensured that they have good quality housing. And it's not just developers who feel there and line their pockets with wealth. Everyone in this country should be entitled and should have an affordable, secure and decent home. That's a fundamental right for every single person in this country. But unfortunately, we have a government that has no direction and no vision. If you recall, Liz Hustings, some of the Hustings that Liz trusted, if you recall, she was moving away from meeting targets, homes and targets. And yet we have a conversation here about supply. So until we get a government with vision, direction, I don't think we will be resolving the housing crisis in this country very soon.
Yes, that's a very good point. As soon as the supply was mentioned, then she ran away from any solutions. Charlie.
I just wanted to come back because the lady there mentioned something which hasn't been mentioned at all, but which is a huge contributing factor to this, which is the financial system. I want to add into that, for brevity, all of government policy, which since we've stopped building council houses, in order to make up for the fact that with the absence of council houses, we start to create a housing crisis, we start to pump money into the system to compensate for the fact there's no longer a supply of council houses in the system. That's inflating house prices. You've also got the banking system, which now almost 90% of banks' business model is based on mortgages, which means every single year they're pumping billions and billions of pounds into international mortgage markets, which is why there is an international correlation with what's going on across the world, because it's happening internationally as well. So you've got all of these inflationary pressures. And in addition to that, once you've got that situation, you now have a safe asset for long-term institutional investors. So now big money sees property and land as a safe investment, which they can invest in, which is why we're building all these empty tower blocks in the middle of cities for Saudis to buy up with nobody to live in. So I think that there's a huge element here, like I say, which we haven't got into at all, which is the financial system which surrounds the entire housing market. And it comes back to the problem of homes as assets and not as homes. And the answer is council housing, council housing, council housing, lots and lots and lots of council housing at capped rents, set, controlled by whichever legislative authority is governing it, to make sure they're at a price that people can afford.
Thank you. Simon.
There is so much that was raised, I can't possibly begin to give it justice. So I'm going to make a couple of observations. People mentioned the international comparisons, and if you want to actually go and look at it, there's a guy called Wendell Cox, who works for an organisation called Demographia, and he publishes for English-speaking countries. I'm afraid he doesn't do it for you, I'm a typical American, a table, a ranking of housing unaffordability. And basically, it's well worth your look, because you will see those places that are doing better. You will see Atlanta and Houston and Nashville, who are doing okay. And you'll see San Francisco and Toronto and places like that doing, and Auckland and Sydney and London and Leicester and Birmingham all doing really badly. It's been a really, I am reminded just how important this debate is. I think it's the most important debate that we should be conducting nationally, and it's a debate that is being conducted very badly by our politicians and in enormous bad faith. But I stick with where I started. Planning is central to the problem. Without planning reform, without reforming urban containment, the greenbelt, we will not solve the housing crisis.
Ike.
Right, just very quickly. The lady talked about tall buildings going up in parts of London, and it doesn't seem that brownfield sites are being used as efficiently as they could be, and that's absolutely right. Particularly in London, also in Manchester as well, there's been an explosion of tall buildings in recent years, and it's based on poor understanding, because people think, oh, tall buildings, you can fit loads of housing there. They're actually not that great as density models. If you look at London, what is the most dense borough in London? It's not the boroughs with the tall buildings, Croydon or the Isle of Dogs because of the towers there. It's Kensington and Chelsea. Kensington Chelsea is rigorous about having height controls and also getting the most out of density. They have mansion blocks there, terraces of housing up to 6, 7, 8, 9 stories high, which fits in with the streetscape, and it doesn't mean you've got these pockets of kind of tall buildings besmirching the urban areas. So we have to get clever about how density works. And just finally, just really quickly, I'm just going to end, as some others have, on a real kind of endorsement of council housing. We do need to have a new generation of council housing here. Why do we need to do that? We need to do that for economic reasons. As that gentleman mentioned over there, it's obscene to be paying housing benefit. Housing benefit mainly goes into the pockets of private landlords. It's the government subsidising private landlords because we don't have the council housing stock. Just quickly finish. £70.1 billion is going to be our housing benefit bill by 2050. It costs £68 billion a year to fund the Russian army. So it's a really, really poor use of money. We really need to get clever about council.
Comparisons you never expected at Battle of Ideas. Austin.
Very very, very quickly, hopefully. The flip side of, I think Charlie's already mentioned it, which is the flip side of unaffordable housing is more pay. So it becomes affordable. And that's the one thing which we haven't really discussed. And you can see that house prices have gone up 4 times in the last 15 years in this country, and pay has basically flatlined. And that's one thing which I think you can see it happening now with the level of strikes because of the entire situation more broadly than just housing. Second thing, in terms of land sales, and the gentleman in front here mentioned China. Unfortunately, if you take a look at what's happened to China with land sale and housing, there's a massive collapse, partly because it was a false GDP. So people were selling land, building crap on it, and pretending it was viable land. And there's a huge bubble which is yet to burst. So I wouldn't look for that for a model. Final thing, I suppose, is on NIMBYism. Wales is a national NIMBY. It's just created a new policy where basically it's going to prioritise local people to live in their villages rather than any outsiders, you lot. And it's kind of, apart from it being faintly racist, but the general rule is that most people want to leave Wales. But on a financial inducement, it's trying to keep you there. So, we need to kind of be wary of fiscal policy and housing in the same breath.
Can we thank the panel, please?